Have you ever looked at a portrait and felt that the eyes staring back were from someone you once loved? That's exactly what happened to a young maid when she saw this painting, and the boy in it turned out to be the child she'd lost years ago in an orphanage. What she discovered next would shake an entire family built on secrets and silence. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? On a misty autumn morning by Willow Lake, a woman carrying a small brown suitcase stopped in front of the Whitmore mansion. The lake stretched wide behind her, still and pale, like a mirror holding the last traces of dawn. A soft wind rustled the maple leaves at her feet. Ellie Vasquez took a deep breath and pulled her coat tighter, feeling that strange mix of hope and fear that comes when life is about to change. She had taken the first bus from Albany, the kind that smelled faintly of diesel and coffee. Through the window, she'd watched the world turn gold and red with the season, and for a moment, she'd almost believed this new job could be a fresh beginning. After all, she wasn't a girl anymore. 33, steady hands, and a record of keeping other people's homes in order. But order was one thing her own life had never truly known. The mansion stood a few yards up the gravel path, 3 stories of stone and wood, its windows catching the dim light like tired eyes. Someone had built it in another century, when things were meant to last. Ellie paused before the front steps, her shoes crunching on the gravel. The brass knocker, shaped like a swan, gleamed faintly under the porch light. She hesitated before knocking, aware of how quiet everything was. No voices, no movement, only the faint lapping of water against the dock. The door opened before she touched it. A tall man stood there, perhaps 39 or 40, dressed neatly but not stiffly, his shirt sleeves rolled up. His expression was polite, almost kind, but there was a distance in his eyes, the kind people wear after too many goodbyes. "Miss Vasquez?" "Yes, sir. Ellie Vasquez. From Albany." He nodded. "I'm Jonathan Whitmore. Thank you for coming. Mrs. Lang spoke highly of you." "She's very kind," Ellie said softly, clutching her suitcase. "It's an honor to work here." Jonathan stepped aside to let her in. The foyer smelled faintly of lemon polish and wood smoke. Everything was spotless, marble floors, tall mirrors, the grand staircase curling upward like a question mark. Yet there was something hollow about it all, like a house waiting for laughter that never came. "You'll find the housekeeping schedule on the kitchen board," he said as they walked. "There's a small room at the end of the west corridor. Mrs. Lang will show you the rest later." "Yes, sir." He turned to go, then hesitated. "You can call me Jonathan. Everyone else does." It felt like a small kindness, and Ellie smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Jonathan." He left her near the hallway, his footsteps fading toward the study. Ellie stood for a moment, suitcase still in hand, feeling the strange hush of the place settle around her. The light through the tall windows was soft and amber, dust motes floating like slow snow. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed 10. She unpacked in her small room, clean, simple, a window facing the lake. From there she could see the dock stretching into the fog and the faint outline of a rowboat tied to its end. She wondered if anyone used it anymore. The lake was beautiful but lonely, the kind of beauty that kept secrets. By afternoon, Ellie had finished unpacking and changed into her uniform, a pale blue blouse and dark slacks. She began dusting the sitting room, careful with the antique furniture, the vases, the photographs on the side table. Most of the frames held landscapes or black and white portraits, all arranged neatly, all untouched by fingerprints. When the grandfather clock struck 3, Mrs. Lang appeared, a woman in her 60s with quick eyes and the faintest French accent. "You're doing fine, dear," she said, inspecting the room. "Mr. Whitmore likes things quiet. No noise, no surprises. The poor man has had enough of both." Ellie nodded. "I understand." Mrs. Lang's voice softened. "You seem kind. That's good. This house hasn't felt kindness in a long while." They worked together until early evening, when the sky over the lake turned the color of pewter. At dinner time, Ellie ate alone in the staff kitchen, soup, bread, and tea, while the faint murmur of a television came from the next room. A news anchor mentioned the upcoming Harvest Fair, a yearly event in the town square. Ellie smiled faintly. She'd never been to a fair. Orphanages didn't have such things. Later, while she washed her cup, she heard slow footsteps upstairs. Jonathan crossing the hallway, perhaps. The sound faded, then silence again. It was the kind of quiet that carried stories if one dared to listen. When the house finally settled into its nighttime stillness, Ellie returned to the living room with her dusting cloth. The fire had gone out, leaving only a faint scent of smoke in the air. The tall windows reflected her own movement as she crossed the room, her small figure mirrored in the glass. She hummed softly an old tune she didn't even remember learning, something that children used to sing at the orphanage on rainy days. The beam of her cleaning lamp slid slowly across the wall. Bookshelves, a mirror, a mantel lined with porcelain horses, and then stopped on the large painting above the fireplace. At first, she didn't notice what she was looking at. Just another portrait in a rich man's house, framed in carved gold. A boy of about 5, wearing a soft blue sweater with a white collar, sitting straight in an old-fashioned chair. His eyes, bright, piercing blue, looked out of the painting with an intensity that made her heart skip. Her hand froze midair. The cloth slipped from her fingers and fell soundlessly to the rug. She stepped closer, breath catching. Those eyes, that face, the small curl of hair over the right brow, she knew it. She'd wiped tears from that same face, years ago, in another life. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." But it was. The name rose from somewhere deep inside her. A word she had not spoken in 17 years, Diego. Her knees weakened. She sank slowly to the polished floor, both hands trembling. The years, between now and then, vanished in an instant. The cold dormitory of St. Mary's Orphanage, the long nights of whispered promises, the tiny boy clinging to her dress each time thunder rolled through the windows. She had taught him how to tie his shoes, shared her bread when he was hungry, held him through every nightmare. And then one day, he was gone, taken by strangers in fine clothes, leaving her standing by the gate with an ache that never faded. Tears blurred her sight. "Diego," she murmured again, the name slipping out like a prayer. Behind her, footsteps echoed firm, quick, unexpected. Ellie wiped her eyes and turned. Jonathan stood in the doorway, startled by the sight before him. The new housekeeper kneeling on the floor, her face pale and wet with tears. "What's going on here?" His voice carried confusion more than anger. Ellie rose unsteadily, pointing toward the portrait. "The boy," she said, her voice shaking. "Where did you get that painting?" Jonathan hesitated, glancing at it. "That's my son, Ethan. He passed away 3 years ago." The room seemed to tilt. "Ethan?" she repeated, almost to herself. He looks so much like—" Jonathan's tone softened, though his eyes stayed wary. "Like who?" She swallowed hard. "A boy I knew at St. Mary's Orphanage in Ohio. His name was Diego. He had those same eyes." Something flickered across Jonathan's expression, a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. "You must be mistaken. My son was adopted as a baby, not an orphanage boy." Ellie shook her head. "I'm not mistaken, sir. I could never forget that face. The day they took him, he held onto my dress and said we'd meet again." Jonathan's lips parted, but no words came. His gaze shifted back to the portrait, tracing the soft brushstrokes of the boy's face, the eyes that once laughed, the smile that he'd tried to paint from memory after the funeral. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Miss Vasquez," he said quietly, "this conversation is unsettling." "I'm sorry," Ellie whispered. "I didn't mean to upset you. It's just when I saw him, it felt like seeing a ghost." Jonathan took a slow breath. He could have dismissed her right then, called her delusional, but something inside him resisted. Maybe it was the trembling honesty in her voice, or the way she looked at the portrait as though it were a window instead of a painting. He studied her closely. "You said his name was Diego?" She nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Diego. He was about 3 when he came to the orphanage. He used to cry at night, calling for a mother who never came." Jonathan's throat tightened. The fireless room felt colder. "That's enough," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Ellie lowered her gaze, ashamed. "Of course. Forgive me. It's been a long day." She gathered her cloth and turned toward the hallway. But before she could leave, Jonathan spoke again, his voice softer, uncertain. "There's something you should know." She turned back slowly. "When Ethan was born, we adopted him through a private attorney, Richard Halloway, my late wife's brother. The records were sealed. We were told he came from a clinic in Cleveland. Ellie froze. Cleveland? Yes. For a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel, steady as a heartbeat. Jonathan glanced at the painting once more. Good night, Miss Vasquez. Good night, sir. Ellie walked toward her room, her steps unsteady. In the dim corridor, she paused by the window. Outside, the lake shimmered under a thin veil of moonlight, and somewhere out there, a loon called mournfully over the water. She pressed her hand against the glass, whispering to the dark reflection of her own face. I found you, Diego, she said. After all these years, I found you. But she didn't yet know that what she had found was not an ending, but the beginning of a truth that would shake both their worlds. Morning came softly to Willow Lake, with a low mist drifting across the water and the pale gold of sunrise reflecting off the kitchen windows. Ellie woke early, as she always did. The quiet here was different from the city, not empty, but full of small sounds. Birds shaking off the dew, the kettle beginning to hum, the whisper of leaves brushing against the porch rail. She tied her hair back, put on her blue blouse, and stepped into the main hall. The air smelled faintly of cedar and soap. She passed through rooms where light was only beginning to reach, leaving long bands of gold on the rugs. The mansion seemed peaceful, but it wasn't the peace of joy. It was the peace of a house that hadn't heard laughter in far too long. As she began dusting the grand piano, she tried not to think about the night before, about the portrait and the boy with the ocean blue eyes. Yet the image stayed with her, just behind her thoughts. Like a melody she couldn't stop humming. She dreamed of him too, standing at the orphanage gate in the rain, clutching a worn blanket embroidered with his name, Diego. Ellie wiped at the corner of her eyes quickly. Don't be foolish, she told herself. You're here to work, not to chase ghosts. When she finished the parlor, she moved toward the living room again. The fire had been relit, warm against the chill. The painting hung exactly where it had before, the boy's gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder. Timeless. She stared at it for just a heartbeat, no more, before returning to her task. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. Jonathan stood in the doorway, freshly shaven, a cup of coffee in his hand. His expression was unreadable. Good morning, he said. Good morning, Mr. Jonathan. He nodded, walking toward the fireplace. For a moment, he simply looked at the painting. You were in here last night. Ellie froze. Yes, sir. I was cleaning. I didn't mean to. You were crying, he said quietly. I heard you. Her heart fluttered. I'm sorry if I disturbed you. He shook his head. You didn't. I just wanted to understand why. She looked down at the duster in her hands. Because that boy looks like someone I once knew. Jonathan's voice dropped. You said his name was Diego. She nodded slowly. Yes, at the orphanage in Ohio. I practically raised him. When he was afraid of thunder, he'd hide under my blanket. When he was hungry, I'd share my bread. Jonathan set his cup on the mantel. His jaw tightened slightly. My son's name was Ethan. He died 3 years ago. I'm sorry, she said softly. Truly, I didn't mean to reopen anything painful. It's not your fault, he said. But there was something in his tone, a small crack, a tremor of weariness. He turned toward the window, where sunlight filtered through thin curtains. It's strange, he murmured. You described a birthmark under the left ear. Ellie blinked. He had that too? Jonathan didn't answer right away. He just looked at the painting again, as if searching for something new in the brushstrokes. Yes, he finally said. But how could you possibly know that? Ellie took a step forward. Because I remember everything about him. The way his eyes lit up when someone read him a story. The way he'd hum before falling asleep. That boy was special, Mr. Whitmore. He never stopped believing his mother would come back for him. Jonathan rubbed a hand over his face. This is impossible. Maybe, Ellie whispered. But sometimes, sir, the impossible is the only thing left that makes sense. He studied her again, really studied her, and for a fleeting moment, the walls he carried seemed to falter. There was exhaustion behind his composure, the kind of grief that had no place left to go. I don't know what to think, he said finally. But the name you spoke, Diego, it was written on the blanket he was found in. We changed it after the adoption. My wife thought Ethan sounded safer. Ellie's breath caught. Then you know it's him. Jonathan turned away, his hands tightening around his coffee cup until his knuckles whitened. No, I know only what I'm told. And what I was told came with signatures, stamps, and official letters. I built my life on them, on those papers. He placed the cup down again, harder this time. But if what you're saying is true, then every page in that folder is a lie. The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile all at once. Ellie wanted to reach out, to say something that could bridge the space between belief and doubt. But before she could, Jonathan spoke again, his voice low and controlled. Leave it for now. I need to think. She nodded, stepping back toward the doorway. Of course, sir. Jonathan didn't move. He stayed there by the fire, staring at the portrait until the coffee grew cold, the boy's painted eyes reflecting the ache he'd tried so long to bury. Outside, the mist began to lift from the lake, revealing the small dock below the mansion. The light touched the water in soft ripples, golden and alive. But inside the house, two souls stood caught between past and present, between truth and fear, and neither yet knew how much their lives were about to change. The afternoon light drifted through the wide windows of Jonathan's study, falling across shelves lined with law books and old family photographs. It was a room that carried silence like a habit. Jonathan sat at his desk, his hands resting on a neat stack of folders. One bore the name Ethan Whitmore, Adoption Records. He had read these pages countless times before: the birth certificate, the notarized letters, the medical forms. They had always been his proof, his armor against grief. But now, after what the new housekeeper had said, the papers seemed suddenly foreign, as if they belonged to someone else's story. He stared at the typewritten lines. Place of origin, Cleveland, Ohio. Adoption finalized, the 9th of December 2014. He knew that date by heart, the day he'd first held the baby in his arms, his wife's tears of joy falling onto the blanket. But he also remembered his brother-in-law, Richard, making every arrangement with alarming speed. You don't need to worry about the details, Richard had said. It's all taken care of. Now, years later, Jonathan wondered what taken care of had really meant. Downstairs, Ellie finished polishing the hall mirror, the soft rhythm of her cloth steadying her nerves. She had promised herself not to speak again of the portrait, but her mind refused to rest. The boy in that painting, Diego, Ethan, whoever he was, had been part of her soul once. She had taught him to spell his name, had watched him draw clumsy hearts on scraps of paper and call them home. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear him say, "One day I'll find you again, Ellie." A floorboard creaked behind her. Jonathan stood there, his face drawn and pale. He held the folder loosely at his side. "Do you have a moment?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Of course." He led her into the study. The air inside smelled faintly of ink and cedar. Jonathan placed the folder on the desk and gestured for her to sit. She didn't. She preferred to stand, her hands folded in front of her like she was back in the orphanage, waiting for a nun to speak. "I looked through everything," he said. "The documents, the adoption papers. They all look legitimate. But I can't stop thinking about that name, Diego. No one has spoken it in my house for years, yet you said it as if you'd just seen him yesterday." Ellie swallowed. "Because I remember him that way. Always small for his age. Big eyes, shy smile, a scar on his right knee from when he fell off the orphanage steps. He wouldn't stop crying until I wrapped my scarf around it like a bandage." Jonathan blinked, his hand tightening on the folder. "He had that scar." She looked up, startled. "Then it's him." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "If it is, then what does that mean? That the boy I buried wasn't even my son?" The words came out rough, almost broken. Ellie felt the pain in them, the disbelief of a man who had already lost everything once. She took a careful breath. Maybe it means there's more truth to find, that someone hid what really happened. Jonathan stared at the papers again, his mind turning over memories he had long sealed away. His wife's father had been powerful, impatient, and wealthy enough to bend rules without consequence. Could he have arranged something unlawful, perhaps even cruel, just to give his daughter a child? "I can't accuse anyone without proof," he said finally. "No," Ellie agreed, "but we can look for it." He met her eyes, surprised by her calmness. "We?" She nodded. "I lived at St. Mary's most of my life. I know where the old records are, who kept them. even the sisters who might still remember me. If there's a truth to uncover, that's where it begins." Jonathan hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. "You'd go back there after all these years?" "I never really left," she said softly. "Part of me stayed the day they took him away." For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking clock filled the silence. Then Jonathan reached for his phone and opened his calendar, scanning the dates as though he were reading a contract. "If we left tomorrow, we could reach Ohio by evening. I have a client meeting I can postpone." Ellie's heart quickened. "You mean it?" He nodded once. "If you're right, Miss Vasquez, I owe it to my son, to both our sons, to find out." A faint smile crossed her lips. "Thank you." Jonathan gathered the papers carefully into a leather briefcase. "St. Mary's Orphanage," he said, testing the name like an old wound. "Does it still stand?" "Yes," Ellie answered. "Gray stone, near the edge of the old highway. They say the bells still ring every evening." He exhaled slowly, then looked up at her. "Then we'll follow those bells." Outside, the late afternoon sky turned silver. A light rain began to fall, dotting the window panes and blurring the reflection of the lake. The house grew quieter still, as if listening to their decision. Ellie lingered a moment by the door. "Jonathan," she said softly. It was the first time she'd spoken his name without hesitation. "Whatever we find, thank you for believing me enough to look." He didn't answer at once. His eyes were on the photograph framed beside the lamp, his wife and Ethan, smiling by the water years ago. The picture seemed smaller now, not because it had changed, but because truth had begun to stretch beyond its frame. As Ellie left the study, he whispered to himself so quietly she didn't hear, "If you're still out there, son, I'm coming for you." Downstairs, the fire flickered against the portrait once more, and the painted boy's eyes caught the light as though, at last, they had begun to see. The next morning began with rain. Thin lines of it traced down the windows, turning the lake outside into a blurred sheet of silver. Jonathan stood by the car, checking the wipers while Ellie packed a small canvas bag. They hadn't spoken much since last night, not out of discomfort, but out of the quiet wait that comes before a difficult journey. By 7, they were on the road. The highway curved through golden hills that had already begun to fade into winter's gray. Ellie sat in the passenger seat, her fingers resting on a thermos of coffee, watching the trees slide by. Jonathan drove carefully, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze distant. For hours, the only sound was the low hum of the engine and a country station whispering from the radio. Occasionally, Jonathan asked simple things. "You warm enough?" Or, "Want to stop for gas soon?" But his voice carried a strain she hadn't heard before. Beneath his composure, something was unraveling. They stopped at a diner just past the state line, the kind with chrome stools and a neon sign that buzzed even in daylight. Inside, the smell of bacon and syrup mixed with the hiss of the coffee machine. The waitress, a cheerful woman in her 50s with a name tag that read Marie, greeted them with a smile. "Morning, folks. Table for 2? "Yes, please," Jonathan said. As they settled into a corner booth, Marie poured coffee and asked about their trip. "Long drive in this weather, huh?" "Heading to Ohio," Ellie replied. "Family business." The woman nodded sympathetically. "Aren't we all chasing some piece of family history these days?" Ellie smiled faintly, stirring her cup. Jonathan stared out the window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. After a moment, he spoke quietly. "I keep wondering if I ever really knew my son's beginning. We celebrated his birthdays, his first steps, his first day at school, and yet maybe everything started with a lie." Ellie looked at him gently. "Love doesn't vanish because the paperwork was wrong. You were still his father." He met her eyes for a moment, and the corners of his mouth softened. "You sound sure of that." "I am," she said simply, "because I saw how you looked at that portrait." Marie returned with pancakes and eggs, and the conversation paused. Around them, the diner buzzed with small-town comfort, the clink of forks, a radio weather report, a group of farmers laughing at the counter. Jonathan left a generous tip when they finished, the old habit of courtesy automatic, as though doing one kind thing might steady the ground beneath him. By late afternoon, they reached Cleveland. The sky hung low and colorless. Jonathan parked in front of a modest building with a faded sign. St. Mary's Orphanage, established 1902. The walls were the same stone, Ellie remembered, weathered but proud, like an old guardian who had seen too much. As they stepped out of the car, she felt her chest tighten. "It hasn't changed," she whispered. "Not even the bell." From somewhere inside, a faint toll echoed slow, patient, timeless. A young nun answered the door, her smile kind but curious. "Can I help you?" Ellie's voice trembled slightly. "I was raised here. My name is Ellie Vasquez. I'm looking for Sister Agnes if she's still here." The nun's face brightened. "Oh, Sister Agnes. Yes, she's still with us. She doesn't see many visitors these days. Please, come in." Inside, the hall smelled of candle wax and old books. Children's drawings lined one wall, stick figures holding hands under rainbows. Ellie ran her fingers across them, remembering nights spent drawing similar pictures, always adding one extra figure in the background, a little boy with blue eyes. They were led to a small office near the chapel. Behind a wooden desk sat Sister Agnes, older now, her posture slightly bent but her gaze still sharp. When she saw Ellie, her eyes filled with recognition. "Eleanor Vasquez," she said softly, using the old name. "My dear girl." Ellie smiled, fighting tears. "It's been a long time, sister." Sister Agnes stood, embracing her. "You were one of the kind ones, always caring for the younger children." Her gaze shifted to Jonathan, tall and silent by the door. "And who might this be?" "This is Jonathan Whitmore," Ellie said. He adopted one of the children who used to be here." The nun's expression grew cautious. "I see. And what brings you both today?" Jonathan stepped forward, his voice calm but heavy. "We need to verify some records, sister. It concerns a boy named Diego, adopted about 17 years ago." The air in the room seemed to change. Sister Agnes's smile faded. She gestured for them to sit, then reached for a large ledger on the shelf. "That was a long time ago," she murmured. "But I remember the name. Diego." "Yes, a quiet boy with striking eyes." She flipped through the yellowed pages until her fingers stopped. "Here, Diego Vasquez, age 8, adopted by the Whitmore family of New York." Jonathan froze. "Whitmore?" Sister Agnes nodded slowly. "That's what it says." Ellie's heart began to pound. "That's you, Jonathan." "Em?" His voice came out barely above a whisper. "But the documents! They said we adopted him from St. Catherine's in Madrid, not here." Sister Agnes sighed. "There were irregularities back then. A private lawyer handled several expedited adoptions. We were told everything was legal." Jonathan's hands tightened on his knees. "Was that lawyer named Richard Halloway?" The nun's eyes flickered with something like regret. "Yes, that was the name." For a long moment, no one spoke. The bell outside rang again, a slow, mournful sound. Ellie reached across the table and touched Jonathan's arm. He looked at her, his face pale. "He sold my son," he said quietly. "My own brother-in-law sold him to us." The rain outside thickened, sliding down the stained glass windows in long, trembling streaks. The truth had finally begun to show its face, and it was far crueler than either of them had imagined. For a long time, no one moved. The sound of rain filled the silence, steady and unrelenting, as if the sky itself refused to let the truth go unheard. Jonathan sat motionless, the words still echoing in his mind. "He sold my son." The idea was monstrous, unthinkable, yet the certainty in Sister Agnes's voice left no room for doubt. Ellie reached across the table, but her hand stopped short, unsure whether comfort would be welcome. Jonathan looked like a man who'd just watched the floor drop out from under him. Sister Agnes closed the ledger carefully, her voice soft but weighted with regret. "There were whispers back then, Mr. Whitmore, about adoptions being handled privately, infants taken from shelters without full consent, papers forged to appear legitimate. We tried to ask questions, but the law favored those who paid the bills." Jonathan stared at her. "You're saying my wife's brother arranged this for us, and he stole the child from here?" The nun's eyes glistened. "I believe he found a way to make the impossible possible. And you, sir, were only the final step." He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "My God!" Ellie spoke gently. "Jonathan, you didn't know. You gave that boy love. You gave him a life." He shook his head. "A life built on a lie. He paced the narrow office, the old wooden floor creaking under his shoes. My wife begged for that child. We waited years. When Richard said there was a baby, I never questioned how. I just signed where he told me to sign. He turned to Sister Agnes, his voice trembling. You must have records. Something that proves where the boy came from before the adoption. She nodded toward a small filing cabinet by the window. We kept duplicates of every record, but most were transferred to the county archives years ago. What's left are only partial copies. Ellie rose and joined her. Together, they sifted through brittle pages, their edges yellowed with time. Baptismal records, transfer forms, a few faded photographs. Then, tucked between two folders, Ellie found an envelope marked Confidential. Attorney Halloway. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single page, a letter dated 17 years ago. Per arrangement, child identified as Diego Vasquez will be transferred to client family within 48 hours. All previous documentation to be sealed. Compensation confirmed. Jonathan read the line twice, his breath catching. He didn't just arrange it, he sold him. The room fell silent except for the rain against the window. Sister Agnes crossed herself quietly. I am so sorry. Jonathan folded the paper slowly, his knuckles pale. Where is Richard now? Ellie answered, her voice low. He lives near Boston. You mentioned it once, your wife's family home by the coast. He nodded grimly. Manchester by the sea. Sister Agnes closed the file. Be careful, both of you. If what you suspect is true, this isn't just about adoption records. It's about a crime buried under years of influence. Jonathan slipped the letter into his coat pocket. Then, it's time to dig it up. As they left the orphanage, the bell tolled once more, its echo rolling through the damp air. Ellie turned back for one last look at the old building, the stone walls, the worn steps, the place where she'd first learned what family could mean, even among strangers. Jonathan held the car door open for her, his expression unreadable but his voice steadier than before. We're going to Boston, he said. Ellie glanced at him. And if he's still hiding something? He met her gaze, the rain streaking his face. Then this time, he won't hide from me. They drove away from St. Mary's as dusk settled over the hills. The wipers swept rhythmically, the road stretching endlessly ahead. In the back seat, the orphanage faded into the fog, a ghost of the past receding behind them. Inside the car, Jonathan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Every mile forward felt like peeling away another layer of illusion. Ellie sat quietly beside him, her heart heavy but resolute. She had spent half her life waiting for answers. Now she was part of the search that could rewrite both their stories. As the headlights pierced the wet dark, Jonathan whispered more to himself than to her. Paper lies can't hold forever. And beside him, Ellie nodded faintly. No, they can't. Not when love remembers the truth. Outside, the rain eased. The sky ahead opened just enough for a sliver of moonlight to touch the highway, guiding them toward the storm yet to come. By the time they reached Massachusetts, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and pale. The ocean spread wide beside the road, its gray surface broken by flecks of white foam. Gulls dipped low over the waves, crying as if to warn them of what waited ahead. Jonathan slowed the car as they entered the quiet seaside town of Manchester by the sea. The streets were narrow, lined with white cottages and leafless maples. In shop windows, lanterns glowed faintly against the early dusk. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a postcard, peaceful, ordinary, but to Jonathan, it felt like walking into a shadow of his own making. Ellie sat beside him, watching the coastline roll past. It's beautiful here, she murmured. He nodded, eyes fixed on the road. My wife loved this place. Her family kept a house on Harbor Street. Richard still owns it. They followed a winding lane that curved toward the cliffs. The sea was louder now, its wind pushing against the car. When Jonathan stopped in front of a tall, weathered home overlooking the bay, Ellie felt a chill run through her. The shutters were drawn tight, but a single light glowed in the study window upstairs. Jonathan turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he said quietly, You don't have to come in. This is my responsibility. Ellie shook her head. You shouldn't face him alone. He gave her a small, grateful look before stepping out. The air smelled of salt and rain, and somewhere far off, a bell buoy clanged in the waves. When Richard Holloway opened the door, surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by that smooth composure Jonathan remembered too well. His hair had thinned, but his eyes still carried that practiced calm of a man used to getting his way. "Jonathan," he said with a polite smile. "What a surprise. I didn't expect family so late in the season." Jonathan's reply was low and controlled. "We need to talk." "Of course, come in." Inside, the house smelled of tobacco and sea air. A fire burned in the hearth, casting a steady orange glow. Richard gestured toward the chairs. "Scotch?" Jonathan ignored the offer. "I'm not here for pleasantries. I'm here about Ethan." For the first time, Richard's smile faltered just slightly. "What about him?" Jonathan set the old letter on the table, the paper marked with Sister Agnes's careful handwriting and Richard's signature at the bottom. "You forged the adoption. You took that boy from St. Mary's without consent, and you sold him to us. My son's life, my entire family began with your deceit." Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what was at stake. My sister was breaking apart. The doctors told her she'd never bear children, and you were drowning in guilt because you couldn't fix it. I did what had to be done." Jonathan's voice hardened. "You stole a child." Richard leaned back, his tone calm but cutting. "A child who got a better life. You raised him well, didn't you? You gave him everything money could buy. So tell me, Jonathan, what are you really angry about? The crime or the lie that made you feel like a savior?" The words hit harder than Jonathan expected. He took a step closer. "You had no right to decide that boy's fate." "And yet," Richard replied smoothly, "you signed the papers without reading them. You wanted a son so badly you didn't care where he came from." Ellie, who had stood silently by the door, finally spoke. "That child was loved at St. Mary's. He had a name, a history, a piece of himself you erased. You didn't save him, you erased him." Richard turned toward her, frowning. "And you are?" "Someone who knew the boy before you stole him," she said, voice steady. A shadow crossed Richard's face, a flash of recognition, then unease. "Ah, the caretaker girl. I remember you, always asking too many questions." Ellie met his gaze without flinching. "I'm still asking them." Jonathan's tone dropped to a whisper edged with fury. "You're going to tell me everything, Richard. How you did it, and what else you've been hiding." "Oh." Richard rose from his chair, setting his glass aside. "Careful, Jonathan. You're treading on things better left buried." "I've already buried one son," Jonathan said. "I won't bury the truth." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The sea roared against the rocks below, its rhythm like a pulse that refused to die. Richard turned toward the window. "You think you're ready for the truth?" he said quietly. "Then meet me at the docks tomorrow morning. There's something you need to see, something that may change everything you believe about that boy." Jonathan's voice was sharp. "Tell me now." Richard smiled faintly. "No, brother-in-law. Some truths need the tide to bring them in." He walked away, leaving the fire crackling behind him. Ellie and Jonathan exchanged a glance, suspicion, fear, and a spark of determination passing silently between them. As they stepped out into the cold night, the ocean wind caught Ellie's hair, carrying the smell of salt and storm. She looked toward the dark line of the docks in the distance. "Do you believe him?" Jonathan's answer came slowly. "I don't know, but if he's hiding something down there, we'll find it." Behind them, through the upstairs window, Richard watched the pair disappear into the fog, his face unreadable. The glow of the fire flickering across eyes that had seen far too many secrets stay buried beneath the waves. Morning came wrapped in fog, so thick it seemed to breathe. The sea was restless, whispering against the shore like a secret too long kept. Jonathan stood at the edge of the dock, his coat drawn tight, his jaw set. Beside him, Ellie shivered in the damp air, watching the slow rhythm of the tide. "I don't trust him," she said quietly. Jonathan's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Neither do I. But if there's even a chance he's telling the truth, I need to know what it is." Footsteps echoed on the planks. Richard appeared through the mist, wearing a heavy wool coat and holding a small metal briefcase. He walked with the slow confidence of a man who believed the world still owed him obedience. "Right on time," he said, his voice smooth as ever. Jonathan didn't reply. Show me. Richard crouched near the end of the dock and set the briefcase down. Before I open this, you should understand what you're asking for. Once you see these papers, you can't unsee them. You'll have to live with what they mean. I've been living with lies for 17 years, Jonathan said. The truth can't be worse. Richard clicked the latches. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, were documents, adoption papers, letters, even photographs. The edges were water-stained, the ink faded but legible. Richard handed him one folder. This, he said, is the original record from St. Mary's, the boys' file before I adjusted it. Jonathan's hand trembled as he opened it. There was the name Diego Vasquez, written in neat script, and beneath it, a photograph, a small boy with deep blue eyes, his expression both curious and frightened. Ellie gasped. That's him! Jonathan's throat tightened. It's Ethan, he whispered. Richard nodded. I thought you should see who he was before the world turned him into something else. He reached for another envelope. And this, he continued, is the report from 3 years ago, the night you thought he drowned. Jonathan froze. What do you mean, thought? Richard sighed. The body recovered from the lake was never officially identified. The hospital records were altered by the same hand that falsified the adoption. Jonathan's voice sharpened. You did this? Richard shook his head. Not me. Someone higher. Someone with power to erase things completely. You were never supposed to question it. Ellie stepped forward. Then who? Richard hesitated, eyes flicking toward the waves. Victoria's father, your wife's father, Jonathan. He wanted control of the inheritance, the company, everything. If the boy lived, it would all pass to him one day. So he made sure the heir disappeared. Jonathan's face went white. You're saying my father-in-law staged my son's death? Richard looked away. He believed it was mercy. The boy was taken, not killed. Sent away under a new name, protected, hidden. But after your wife died, there was no reason to keep him alive in the system. The dock groaned under the weight of silence. Jonathan stared at the fog, hearing only the steady crash of waves against the pilings. Where is he now? Richard's voice was barely audible. Switzerland, near Lake Geneva. I sent money for his care when I could. He's been under guardianship since. Jonathan's breath caught. The world seemed to tilt. He's alive. Ellie placed a hand on his arm, her eyes filling with tears. I told you, love remembers the truth. Richard closed the briefcase and straightened. I've given you everything I have. But you must understand, if you go after him, others will try to stop you. The kind of men who built their fortunes on buried mistakes don't take kindly to ghosts returning. Jonathan's expression hardened. Then let them try. I buried my boy once. I won't do it again. A gust of wind swept through, scattering salt spray across the dock. The fog began to lift, revealing the horizon pale gold where the sun fought its way through. Jonathan held the photograph of the blue-eyed boy close to his chest. Ellie looked out toward the sea. What now? He turned to her, his voice steady, resolute. Now we go find him. Richard watched as they walked away, the mist closing around them like the curtain at the end of a long play. He called after Jonathan one last time. Be careful what you dig up, Whitmore. The truth isn't kind to the living. Jonathan didn't look back. He slipped the photograph into his coat pocket and kept walking toward the car, toward the road, toward the faint hope waiting beyond the ocean. As they drove away, Ellie glanced at him. You think he told us everything? Jonathan's eyes stayed on the highway ahead. No, he said, but it's enough to start. Behind them, the sea roared louder, as if it, too, remembered the boy who had once been lost and the father now brave enough to bring him home. The train from Zurich wound its way along Lake Geneva beneath a pale winter sky. Snowflakes drifted lazily, brushing the glass as Jonathan stared outside, lost in thought. Across from him, Ellie held the photograph of the blue-eyed boy between her fingers, the same picture that had carried them across oceans. Do you really think it's him? She asked. Jonathan's answer was quiet. A father knows his child, even after years. By evening, they reached Montreux. The air smelled of pine and smoke, and the lake mirrored the fading light. Following the address Richard had given them, they stopped before a stone villa surrounded by frost-coated hedges. A warm light glowed behind the curtains upstairs. A shadow moved across it. A child. Jonathan's breath caught. It's him. They waited until the car in the driveway pulled away, then crossed the road. Ellie offered to go first. He doesn't know me as a threat. Let me try. The door opened to a woman in a gray uniform, the housekeeper. Yes? Ellie smiled gently. My car broke down. May I use your phone? The woman hesitated, then allowed her in. The warmth of the room wrapped around Ellie, the scent of wood, of sugar, of something once called home. At a piano near the window sat a boy of about 10, his hair falling over his forehead, his fingers pressing soft notes into the air. Bonsoir, he said shyly. Ellie's heart stopped. That's beautiful, she whispered. When he looked up, she saw them those same eyes. Do you remember, she asked carefully, a big bell that rang every morning before breakfast? The boy frowned, thinking, with the sisters? And bread? Her voice trembled. Yes, and a girl who shared hers. Recognition flickered. Carmen? Tears filled her eyes. You remember. He ran into her arms, and for a moment, the years between them vanished. The housekeeper stood frozen, a hand to her lips. Ellie looked at her and said softly, that boy's father is alive waiting just outside. Ugh. The woman hesitated, then nodded. Go. Quickly. Ellie led the child through the snow toward the road. Across the lane, headlights blinked twice Jonathan's signal. The boy paused, frightened. Uncle said my father's dead. She knelt beside him. He lied, sweetheart. Look, he's right there. Jonathan stepped out of the car, the wind catching his coat. For a long heartbeat, father and son stared at each other through the falling snow. Then the boy whispered, Dad? Jonathan's breath broke. He knelt, gathering the child into his arms. Yes, Ethan, it's me. Ethan clung to him, sobbing quietly, as Ellie stood nearby, her own tears falling. Somewhere behind them, a door slammed. A man's angry shout tore through the night. Raphael had returned. Jonathan looked up, fierce now. Get in the car. Oh. They ran through the storm, the snow swallowing their footprints as they disappeared into the road, a father, a son, and the woman who had never stopped believing. The storm came down from the mountains like a living thing. Snow swirled in blinding sheets, coating the narrow alpine road where Jonathan's car climbed slowly toward the border. The wipers struggled to keep up, the world outside dissolving into white. Ellie sat in the back seat beside Ethan, keeping the boy wrapped in a wool blanket. His small fingers clutched hers tightly. Are we still far, Miss Ellie? He whispered. Not far, sweetheart, she said softly. Just a little longer. Jonathan didn't speak. Every curve demanded his full attention. The headlights caught flashes of pine and rock, but mostly there was only snow, endless, relentless snow. He had driven through worse weather before, but never with something so precious in the back seat. A sudden glare in the mirror made his stomach tighten. Two lights, far behind, but moving fast. Ellie saw it too. Someone's following us. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Raphael. The road wound higher into the mountains. The tires skidded once, catching again on the icy gravel. The storm was louder now, wind howling like a warning. Ethan's voice trembled. Dad, is he coming to take me back? Jonathan's answer was steady but low. No, son. He's never taking you anywhere again. They reached a fork in the road, one path leading toward the main highway, the other curving into a logging trail buried in snow. Jonathan turned sharply down the second path and cut the headlights. The darkness swallowed them whole. For long minutes, the only sound was the storm. Jonathan slowed the car until it rolled to a stop under the shadow of fir trees. His breath fogged the windshield. Ellie leaned forward. Do you think he saw us turn? I don't know, Jonathan murmured. But we'll stay quiet until the storm hides our tracks. The wind beat against the car, like the sea against rocks. Ellie brushed snow from the rear window and saw nothing but white. The world felt suspended, just them, the storm, and the faint warmth of each other's breath. Ethan drifted to sleep against her shoulder, his face peaceful at last. Ellie looked toward Jonathan, whose silhouette was barely visible in the dark. He hadn't moved. His hand still gripped the steering wheel. You should rest, she said softly. He shook his head. Not yet. I can't close my eyes knowing he's still out there. Ellie's voice was warm. You've already done the hardest part. You found your son. Jonathan turned toward her, his eyes tired but full of quiet fire. Finding him was only half the battle. Keeping him safe, that's the rest of my life. Outside, the storm began to ease. The snow slowed, and through the shifting clouds, a faint moon appeared silver light over a white world. Jonathan exhaled for the first time in hours. When the road clears, we'll find shelter. Just till morning. Ellie nodded. There's a cabin ahead. I remember seeing it on the map. He started the car again, guiding it carefully down the narrow path. The mountain loomed above them, cold and ancient, but somewhere beyond it waited the border and the beginning of their freedom. They found the cabin just after midnight, a small wooden shelter tucked among pines, half buried in snow. Jonathan parked near the porch, and they hurried inside. The door creaked open, releasing a smell of old wood and ash. Ellie found matches and lit a fire in the stone hearth. The flames came slowly, orange and soft, spreading warmth through the tiny room. Jonathan laid his coat across the floor for Ethan to sit on. The boy stared into the fire, eyes shining with reflection. It's warm, he said with a sleepy smile. Jonathan smiled faintly. It's better than the Ritz tonight. Ellie laughed quietly, the first real laugh since this nightmare began. You'd better hope the Ritz doesn't charge by the icicle. For a few peaceful minutes, they simply sat three lost souls, finding stillness in the middle of nowhere. The wind outside softened into a whisper. Ethan looked up at his father. Did you really look for me all this time? Jonathan's voice was low, trembling.
Every day, son. I looked everywhere, even when they said you were gone.
The boy's lower lip quivered. Uncle said you forgot me. Jonathan moved closer, pulling him into his arms. Never. Not once. You were the reason I kept breathing. Ellie turned away, tears blurring her vision. The sight was too raw, too beautiful. Minutes later, the boy fell asleep in his father's lap. Jonathan brushed a strand of hair from his son's forehead, his hand trembling.
He sleeps just like he did when he was little,
he murmured. Ellie smiled softly. Children never forget how to dream, even when we do. For a long time, the two adults sat in silence, watching the fire's glow dance against the walls. The storm outside faded into the distance. Just before dawn, Jonathan stepped outside to check the road. The air was crisp and clear, stars still faint above the peaks. In the valley far below, faint headlights moved slowly along the highway. Raphael was still searching. Jonathan looked back at the cabin, where his son slept safely for the first time in years. He whispered to the night, You can follow me, but you'll never take him again. When he went back inside, Ellie was tending the fire. Their eyes met no words, just a quiet understanding. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had won this night. Jonathan sat beside his son again, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in 17 years, peace didn't feel like a stranger. Outside, the sun began to rise over the Alps, pale gold, spilling across the snow, lighting the road that would carry them home. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains hushed under a pale morning light. Inside the small cabin, the fire burned low, throwing shadows across the wooden floor. Jonathan sat awake beside it, unable to rest. His son slept between blankets near Ellie, both breathing softly the sound of peace after too much fear. When the first pink glow touched the window, Jonathan stepped outside. The air was sharp and clean, each breath a sting of life. He stood on the porch, looking out over the valley, and whispered a quiet prayer, not of thanks, but of resolve. Then he heard the crunch of boots on snow. Raphael emerged from the tree line, his coat torn, his face ghostly pale. You're a hard man to follow, he said, voice hoarse. Jonathan didn't reach for the gun he didn't carry. He only said, It's over, Raphael. Walk away. Raphael gave a tired laugh. You think this ends with me? You think the truth sets you free? No, Jonathan. The truth burns everyone it touches. He tossed a small envelope into the snow between them. Everything's inside your father-in-law's orders, the payments, the boy's false death certificate. You'll find what you're looking for. But when you read it, remember you were part of it too. Jonathan's voice shook, quiet but cutting. I was blind, not guilty. Raphael smirked faintly. Blindness is just another way of refusing to see. A door creaked. Ellie stepped out, the dawn behind her. Enough, she said firmly. The boy's inside. He doesn't need to hear any more lies. Raphael's eyes softened for a moment, a flash of something human beneath the bitterness. He was never meant to suffer, he whispered. I wanted to protect him, not... He broke off, coughing into his hand. Jonathan took a step forward. If you ever cared for him, end this now. Tell the police everything. Raphael met his eyes, weary. They're already coming. I sent for them hours ago. Oh. In the distance, faint sirens began to echo through the mountains. The sound grew, bouncing off the frozen cliffs, a hymn of justice long delayed. Jonathan didn't speak. He just looked toward the cabin, where his son stirred by the fading fire. The police arrived just as the first sunlight spilled over the peaks. They moved carefully, their boots crunching through the snow, the light from their flashlights fading into the dawn. Raphael stood still, his head bowed, as they handcuffed him without struggle. Jonathan watched in silence, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. A Swiss officer turned to him. Are you Mr. Whitmore? Yes. Then you and the boy will be escorted to Bern for questioning. After that, you're free to return home. Jonathan nodded slowly. His voice was low. We'll tell them everything, but not here. Raphael looked up one last time, his face lined with exhaustion. Be careful, Jonathan. Truth doesn't heal as fast as love does. Jonathan met his gaze. No, but it keeps us from dying inside. As they led Raphael away, the man didn't resist, just disappeared into the white, his footprints soon swallowed by snow. Inside the cabin, Ethan sat near the door, rubbing his eyes. Dad? What happened? Jonathan knelt beside him, brushing hair from his forehead. It's all right, son. It's over. Are we going home? Jonathan smiled softly. Yes, home. Ellie watched them, her eyes full of quiet relief. The fire crackled low, warm against the cold morning. She handed Jonathan a steaming mug of coffee she'd made from the last of the supplies. He took it, their fingers brushing briefly. Thank you, he said. She smiled. You don't have to thank me. You just have to keep that promise, never stop looking for the light. Outside, the sirens faded. Only the wind remained, gentle now, whispering through the trees like a benediction. Jonathan looked once more toward the rising Sunday. For the first time in 17 years, he wasn't haunted by shadows. The truth hadn't destroyed him. It had freed him, and the boy who was his heart. He lifted Ethan into his arms, feeling the warmth of life where there had once been only loss. Ellie opened the door. Together, they stepped into the new light of morning, leaving behind the ashes of what had been and walking toward what could finally be called home. Spring sunlight shimmered on the quiet surface of Willow Lake. The mansion stood where it always had, yet something about it felt different now, warmer, alive. The air carried the scent of new grass and rain. Jonathan leaned against the porch rail, a mug of coffee steaming in his hand. He watched Ethan skipping stones near the shore, each throw sending ripples through the calm water. Every splash felt like forgiveness, gentle, real, unstoppable. Ellie stepped outside, carrying a small tray. You didn't finish your breakfast, she said with a smile. He glanced at her. I was waiting for company. She set the tray down beside him and followed his gaze toward the lake. The boy's laughter echoed through the still morning. He's healing, she said softly. Jonathan nodded. We both are. Inside, the house smelled faintly of polish and fresh paint, the scent of renewal. What had once been cold marble and silence now held the sounds of life again. Footsteps, music, laughter in small doses. Ellie wrapped her arms around herself against the mild breeze. When you first came to the orphanage, I thought you were just another man chasing closure. But you were chasing love. Jonathan smiled faintly. It took me a long time to realize they were the same thing. They stood in comfortable silence for a while. The lake glimmered, reflecting clouds like brushstrokes across the blue. From the nearby church, the faint sound of a bell drifted through the air, slow, steady, familiar. Ethan turned from the water and waved. Dad, look! He held up a skipping stone shaped like a heart. This one's lucky. Jonathan walked down to meet him, crouching to take the stone. Then we'll keep it forever. The boy grinned and slipped his small hand into his father's. You promise? I promise, son. Behind them, Ellie smiled quietly, the sunlight warming her face. The three of them walked back toward the porch, their shadows stretching long and peaceful behind them. That evening, soft orange light filled the living room. A new portrait hung above the mantel, Ethan, between Jonathan and Ellie, all smiling. The boy's eyes still carried traces of sadness, but they also held something brighter. Hope. Jonathan poured 3 cups of cocoa. "To new beginnings," he said, handing one to Ellie and one to his son. Ethan tilted his cup carefully. "And to never giving up." They clinked mugs, laughter gentle and real. Outside, frogs had begun to sing near the reeds, the small, steady sounds of a world that had finally made peace with itself. After dinner, Ethan fell asleep on the couch, curled beneath a soft quilt. Jonathan lifted him easily, carrying him upstairs. For a moment he paused at the doorway, watching the boy breathe. "Good night, my son," he whispered. Back downstairs, Ellie stood near the window, looking out at the moon reflected on the lake. Jonathan joined her, quiet for a while. Then he said, "I used to think redemption came through punishment. Now I see it's through love." She nodded. "You didn't just find your son, Jonathan. You found yourself." He looked at her, eyes soft. "And you gave me courage when I had none." Ellie smiled. "You gave me family." They stood side by side as the night settled over the lake. The air hummed with crickets, and the water shone silver under the moonlight. Jonathan reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. From somewhere far across the water, a bell rang again, steady, calm, carrying into the night. Jonathan closed his eyes and whispered, "We're finally home." End of quote. The sound of the bell faded into silence, leaving only the rustle of the wind through the willows and the soft heartbeat of the lake, the sound of a family, whole again. Sometimes, the quietest endings speak the loudest truths. When the snow melted on Willow Lake, and the laughter of a boy finally echoed through the halls of that once empty house, something deep within the heart of a man, and perhaps within each of us, found its way back home. We all know that feeling, don't we? The ache that time alone can't heal until kindness, forgiveness, and love take their turn to do what years of silence could not. Jonathan's journey wasn't about wealth or reputation. It was about rediscovering what truly matters: the sound of a child's laughter, the warmth of shared cocoa, the hand that reaches out when life has worn us thin. Ellie's quiet strength, the boy's innocent hope, they reminded us that sometimes redemption comes softly, like spring thawing the last of winter's ice. And maybe that's what this story has been whispering all along, that love, given freely, has the power to rewrite every mistake. That even those who've lost their way deserve a second chance to find the light again. Because love, the steady, forgiving kind, is what builds homes, not walls. It's what keeps us warm long after the fire burns low. Like the porch light left on for a loved one who hasn't yet come home, a single act of kindness can guide someone back from the darkest road. And in a world that often measures worth by success or noise, the truest victories are still found in quiet kitchens, around old dinner tables, where someone simply says, "I forgive you," as in fine. So tonight, as you sit with your own memories, maybe holding a warm cup of coffee, maybe listening to the hum of a radio, think of the people who once made your heart feel like home. Reach out, rebuild, because happiness doesn't live in perfection. It lives in love that chooses to stay. If this story touched your heart, press 1 the comments, and if there's something you'd change or share from your own life, press 0 and tell us. Your voice matters here, because stories like this one belong to all of us, to anyone who's ever been lost and found again. And remember, even the smallest light, left burning in kindness, can still lead someone safely home.